Hi, welcome back to Structured Product Management Thinking. I'm your host, Kurt Van Etten, and in this module we are going to talk about sprint planning and agile execution. So in our last module, we created a product backlog, and now we have a list of user stories that we want to do, and we need to do two things. We need to estimate the amount of effort and complexity of those stories, and then we need to decide which of those stories do we want to do in the next sprint, otherwise known as iteration, in order to begin the development process. So we have our product backlog. Our product backlog will usually be in a system like this. Typical tools are Jira, Pivotal Tracker, and there's many others. But you're going to have a list of your user stories. They'll typically have a system-generated ID number, a title. Maybe the product owners put some loose priority around those. And now you need to fill out the estimation column. And we're going to do that in story points. And once we have those estimations, we're going to sit down with the engineering lead, the scrum master, and the product owner, and we're going to decide which ones are we going to do in the next sprint. And we're going to choose a subset of the product backlog to create our sprint backlog. So, what is a story point? So this is really important, and this is a very, very common mistake. There's a lot of confusion when I've gone in organizations about what's a story point, how to use it. And so let's really bear down and spend some time talking about a story point. So in Agile methodology, a story point is a relative measure of effort, complexity, uncertainty that's involved in completing a particular task. What it is not is a representation of time. And this is probably the most common mistake I see. The teams will come together and they'll say, hey, 2 weeks worth of work, let's call that 8 story points. That is not correct, right? Because 8 story points could be 2 weeks of work for 3 people. It could be 1 week of work for 6 people, right? And it could be a month's work for a single person. So we're trying to measure the amount of effort and complexity and not the amount of time. So when we talk about story points, we want to use a range to estimate those. And the most common is the Fibonacci sequence seen here, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, and 13. The reason this works well and is popular is because the difference between a 1 and 2 is pretty simple and it's easy to get to that level of granularity. It's much harder to get at granularity when you're talking about larger, more complex, more uncertain user stories. And the way you do this is you measure things relative to each other. So if you're going to sit down for the first time as a team and look at your product backlog, you should take a look at it and pick something that the team agrees is kind of in the middle, not too complex, not too simple, and maybe you call that 5 story points, and then you're going to measure the rest of the story points from that. If it looks more complex than that, maybe it's an 8 or a 13. If it's less, maybe it's a 1, 2, or 3. Again, do not associate story points with time. So when I've explained this to my teams in the past, I've used this analogy and it's worked pretty well for me. And so let's try it again here. So let's think about you're a construction site manager and your job is, I'm going to take a pile of rocks from the construction site and I need to move them out of the way and I'm going to throw them in a grass field. And so the user story is, as construction manager, I need to move a pile of rocks from the construction site to a field in order to start laying the foundation. And so now we have to estimate the amount of effort and complexity and uncertainty with this job, and you're going to have the team do the estimation. This is the most important aspect here. You want the team to do the estimation and not just a single engineer. So in this case, the crane operator has to give their input, the truck driver, the safety supervisor, maybe people that have to shovel rocks at the end, who's ever on your particular scrum team or pod, they need to look and discuss how much effort this is, and they decide whether it's 5 points, So if we take that and move to more of a software example, and now I have our user story. As a patient, I need to search for a physician by the distance from my location. Again, the estimation needs to be done by the team. So yes, the engineer will say, hey, yeah, okay, that looks a little complex. That's 8 points, but you need other team members that are impacted to also give an estimation. Maybe you have a front engineer, a back end engineer. Maybe you have a QA person, tech writer, whoever is going to be involved in the execution of the story all needs to give their input. And we had talked about that last time, where user story will have multiple tasks. So it has been my experience, there's been cases where something may be a very simple engineering change, but it's very broad in scope and impactful, and turns out to be a lot of work for the QA team or a lot of work for the tech writer, because they have to change these things in multiple places. And so you do not want to rely solely on the engineer to give the estimate. And this is really, really important point, because when you would go to measure velocity in the next module, you're going to measure velocity as a team and not as a single engineer. So as you're going through these user stories, you're going to find a lot of stories, maybe 8 points, 13 points, and you're putting at risk trying to complete each of these user stories within your sprint. So let's say we're running 2-week sprints, and you may have a 13-point story, and it's pretty risky to try to get that done given the amount of resources you have available or other stories. And so it's on the product owner to work with the team and split these stories and to get them as small as possible. There are multiple ways to split user stories, and I'm going to go over 6 methods. There's many more. We can spend an entire module on just splitting user stories. If anyone is interested in learning about splitting user stories and more methodologies and more I'm going to cover here, by all means, reach out to me via email or put comments below. But let's go over 6 common methodologies. So one is split by workflow steps. This is the most obvious one. As a user, I want to order a product online, and you split those up into stories of I want to search for the products, I want to add the products to my cart, and I want to complete the checkout process. Another way to split stories is by the input types. So I have a story here. As a user, I want to upload files to the system, and maybe you have a different story around I want to upload my files from a computer, or I want to upload files from a cloud storage. Maybe there's a different story when you're going to get those files via API. So these are all different ways you can split stories as well. Split by data are parameters. We've already given an example of this. I want to filter products by multiple criteria, and so we're going to write a user story that's going to filter products just by price. I just want to do it by category or do it by brand. Another way to split the user stories is the happy path versus the edge cases. And if you remember correctly, when we wrote our use cases, and actually when we used generative AI to help us write the use cases, they gave us some exception criteria or edge cases as it's written here. So for example, I want to reset my password. The happy path is I want to reset my password when I provide an email. But there also may be an edge case here. As a user, I want to receive an error message for an invalid email input. So this is also known as exception cases. Very common way that I use quite frequently is splitting the user stories is splitting them by CRUD operations. So for example, here as an admin, I want to manage user accounts. Well, I have a table maybe with user accounts, and so you want to split them up like I want to create a user, I want to view a user account, I want to edit the user account, or I want to delete the user account, and making these all individual stories. Another way to split the user story is actually by the actor or the user role. So here as a user, I want to access a dashboard. As a regular user, I want to view my personalized dashboard, but there's probably a different user story for the administrator. As an administrator, I want to view an overview dashboard for all users. Okay, so many ways to split stories. Certainly in art form itself, it takes practice, and it also takes the team's help. And once you've done that, you now have estimation of all the stories in your product backlog that you're going to consider for the sprint. You need to move into sprint planning. So you first want to make sure that all the stories meet the definition of ready, and this definition of ready is determined by the team. And so a very typical example of definition ready might be that everyone understands the story, it's fully estimated, you agree it's not too large, and then there's other criteria that you can add. So again, from my personal experience, we added criteria around the wireframes need to be approved. What was happening in this case is the team started going into the sprinting, and there was a lot of churn and a lot of questions around the front end work, the user interface. And we finally agreed that no, the UX team had to present wireframes ahead of time. They had to attach it both at the epic level and the user story, and the engineering teams reviewed it and was comfortable with it and felt that they could execute on it within the sprint. Another example that we used was approved API skeletons. There was a concern that we had different teams writing different APIs, using different skeletons, making it really inconsistent and making it really difficult to publish these APIs. And from a user perspective, making it difficult. So we put a process in place to have approved API skeleton, and that became part of our definition of ready. The sprint planning ceremony does not require the entire team. I've also seen this where teams will go through a lengthy process of going through the product backlog and estimating, and then we bring the whole team back again for sprint planning. That's not necessary. If you have all these stories that have met the definition of ready, you really only need the product owner, the scrum master, and the tech lead to sit down and decide which stories are going to go into the next sprint. So now we've taken our product backlog, we've added the stories, we've made sure they meet the definition of ready, and we've created our sprint backlog. And so you can see here, the sprint backlog, you should have some idea of your velocity or your capacity. So maybe in this example, based off previous sprints, we think this team can deliver around 11 story points. You'd probably have your sprint backlog look something like this, where you have your high priority story up front, maybe the most complex one up front. That's 8 points. You would have another 3, and then you're probably asking yourself, hey Kurt, why is there another 3 if you said the velocity is 11? Well, you should have something ready to go in case something happens to one of the other stories. Maybe you're fortuitous. Maybe another engineer got added to your Scrum team and you have more capacity. You already know which one to do. Or maybe the second story here, filter by specialty, gets blocked, and you know which one's right. So you should overplan a little bit for your sprint backlog, but not by much, maybe 20% at the most. Okay, so sprint planning. You want to estimate the user stories of the team, and we'll talk about a key mantra here when it comes to Agile methodology, and that is we're going to move from a me mentality to a we mentality. And estimating the stories as a team puts that culture in place, that you're working together to get a team and you want to make sure that everyone's representative and has input. You want to split the user stories all the time, whenever possible. My rule with my teams was if a user story was at 13 points, immediately they should look and try to split that story. All stories need to meet a definition of ready. That definition is well defined, and those stories are reviewed. Anti-patterns here. Engineering only estimates, just assigning a story to a single engineer, they doing the estimate, they're really not taking into account the testing aspects of it or other aspects of the story. Stories are too large, they go from sprint to sprint, and you want each story to be small enough that you have a lot of confidence that it can be completed within that increment. And associating story points with time or duration. Again, it's a measure of complexity, effort, and uncertainty, and it is not a measure of time. Okay, so Agile best practices. I mean, why has Agile been so widely adopted, right? We're trying to maximize clarity and speed within the team. We're trying to set up an environment of continuous feedback and continuous iteration. And again, to be successful in this, it really takes a culture shift of moving from a mentality of me, my work, what do I get done, to what we as a team are going to need to deliver. And that's why the focus has to be on the user story, because that is the representation of creating customer value. So here's some best practices I'm going to share with you. And these are the things, if you're going to do nothing else as far as implementing Agile, do these things. The first thing you should do is create a team working agreement. This is a living document that you're going to continuously update as your team works, but it makes very clear what everyone's role is, how you're going to work, and it saves so much misunderstanding. And I'll share with you a couple war stories here in a moment. But a team working document really is that living contract of how people are going to work. You want to spell out the roles. Who's a product owner? Succinctly, what does a product owner do? Who's the scrum master? What does a scrum master do? Who's the tech lead, etc. Listing everybody on the team and what is their role. Then you're going to negotiate on your meeting cadence. So a DSU stands for daily stand-up. Agile methodology suggests that you have a 10-minute meeting every day where everyone's standing up and everyone gives updates. My experience is most teams don't want to do every day. They end up doing 4 days a week, and that's totally fine. You're going to agree on a cadence of doing your end of sprint demos, when you're doing retrospectives, etc. But it's very clear how often the team is meeting, how long they're meeting for, when are they meeting, and laying it out in this document. You're going to lay out some very clear definitions around definition of ready, which we've already discussed, and say, hey, we are not picking up a story and moving into the sprint backlog unless it meets these requirements. Again, examples, it's fully estimated, wireframes approved, API skeletons approved, etc., whatever your team is going to decide. And then the story is not done until it meets certain criteria, and we call this the definition of done. Is it fully complete? Does it meet the quality standards to be closed? For example, it's fully tested. Any bugs associated with that story are closed. This is very common where I've seen engineering teams go in, they'll pick up a story, they'll test it, there'll be bugs, and they'll close the story and then try to reopen another story to fix those bugs. That is not the definition of done, right? You should have quality standards that the team can discuss about, hey, do all the bugs need to be fixed completely for the story to be closed? Or maybe you're okay with all the P0s and the P1s and the P2s are closed, but if there's a P4, we'll let it go. Again, this is up to the team, and part of Agile methodology is pushing the decision-making down to the individual teams, and so it is for them to decide. And another important one is escalation paths. Another war story here. I was working one day, I got a phone call from engineering managers. He's saying, hey, there's guys in our team that want the product manager fired because he's not responsive and he is not updating things in a timely manner and blocking the team. And I was like, wow, that's a little extreme, calling for someone to get fired. And I did some digging, and what I found out was that they were updating things in Jira and asking questions and expecting the product manager to give updates in there. And the product manager was extremely busy and didn't know to look there, and said, well, if they would have just slacked me, I would have known right away, and I would have known to get on it and prioritize it over other things if they were blocked. And it was just something as simple as that. I said, guys, you need to create a team working agreement. And we created a team working agreement, and the team decided, hey, if it's something blocking, that they'll slack the product owner. And if it wasn't, they would update in Jira. He'd agreed he would check Jira once a day. And they also agreed on the escalation paths. Like, hey, why didn't no one go to the product manager to complain? Why did they go to the engineering manager who ended up talking to the SVP of product? And so they agreed on an escalation path as well. So you can see how powerful a simple document can be, that whole situation could have easily been avoided. Okay, daily stanza. Again, this is probably something that I've seen, and I would say I rarely see anyone do this correctly. I think it's because when it first rolled out, the initial training was stating, like, you go around the room and you say, hey, what I'm going to work on, if I'm blocked or not. And it became an individual thing, what I call going around the horn. That is not the best practice. Again, that is a very me mentality kind of thing. So what happens in reality is everyone's on the Zoom call or in the room, and what are they thinking about? Well, they're thinking about what they're going to say. I'm not really listening to everyone else. And as you go around the room, people are saying, yeah, I'm working on the new API, but I'm need to go pick up my daughter from soccer practice early, so I probably won't get it done today, and around the horn. And it becomes an update meeting. You don't want this to be an update meeting. That's really not a lot of value for everyone. Remember, the game that you're playing is trying to create customer value. And let me say that again. You need to create customer value as a team. This is a team sport. And how do you get points? You get points by closing the user story. So a good daily stand-up should start with the Scrum Master pulling up the plan for that sprint and saying, hey, here's the 4 stories we're trying to get done in the sprint. What's going on story 1, right? And you could give the same update and say, hey, I have one engineering task associated with story 1, which is an API engineering task. I don't think I'll be able to get it today. And a good team and a good Scrum Master will say, hey, can anyone else pick that up? Another example. Hey, I'm only going to get the story done on Monday. I know the sprint ends on Wednesday. I'm not sure I'll be able to get it tested. Hey, can someone jump in and test? Can another engineer help out and test? This is the prime example of going from me to we. And when this works, it is magic. I have had tech writers jump in and start testing software because the engineer or the QA person didn't have the capacity, because the team was so focused on closing the user story and getting it done and creating that customer value. The other ceremony that you should absolutely do is end of sprint demos. So you may be running iterations of 2 weeks or 3 weeks, doesn't matter. At the end of that iteration, you should have completed those user stories, and you now want to demo this functionality to everyone, and you should do it to a very broad audience. So again, when we talked about having your Scrum team or that pod consisting of the execution team, right? The engineers, the QA, UI designers, all those associated people, you want to invite all the stakeholders, the people that are going to be affected by the use of this product. Someone from customer support, someone from sales or sales engineering, professional services, whoever are the key stakeholders in this and have a vested interest in this product, you should invite them to the end of sprint demo, and at a minimum, you should record it. And the way you run a good end of sprint demo is the product owner should start, and the product owner should explain why you're doing this. What's the customer problem? What's the proposed solution? Just very succinctly, it shouldn't take more than 20 seconds, and saying, hey, what we're doing here is we're helping patients find physicians online. What we did in this sprint is we allowed it to be able to do by distance and turn it over for the demo. The demo is best done by a QA person. And why would I say a QA person? A QA person's job is to test the product from a customer perspective. And that is very distinct from an engineering perspective. Engineers are focused on making it work. QA people are focused on making sure it doesn't break. So the QA person is the best person to give the demo. The Scrum Master or someone should record all the comments associated with the end of the sprint demo. So a comment here, in the end of sprint demos, you do tend to have executives, managers, senior managers, directors, etc., attending this end of sprint demo. It is important that the product owner understands that it's their product backlog, and they necessarily don't have to do everything that someone says them to do or makes any comment. So as a product executive, I make sure that my team understands I'm going to make comments. I've looked at a lot of products over the year. I'm going to have questions. Just because Kurt made the comment versus Sally making the comment doesn't mean that you should jump through hoops and do what Kurt's comment is first. You're the product owner. It's you and your team to decide what the priorities are. And so you should take those comments, throw them in your product backlog, and go through the regular process. And it's really important that the team understand that and they don't overreact to executive comments. Okay, Immediately after the end of sprint demo, you should have a retrospective. I think it's a best practice that just the two meetings go together. As soon as the end of sprint demo is over, you can dismiss all the outside stakeholders. And this is your meeting as a team to improve the process. And that is what it's for. And I think this also is something that gets misused or misunderstood. The retrospective is for the team only. It's really important that you kick all the upper management out of the meeting. It should be just that Scrum team or that pod. You should review your metrics, and we're going to talk about metrics in the next module because they can help you identify where you may need to improve. You want to document what went well in that sprint, what didn't go well, and you want to keep an action items and make sure at the next retro you review the action items from the retro before. Again, it's really important that the team understand the purpose of this is not to call out someone that did a bad job or point fingers. It's to improve the team. And it takes a degree of maturity to understand that. And it also takes the appropriate culture that people feel free that they can make comments and discuss it and all come in with the mindset of how do we get better as a team. Okay, so I'm going to make some comments here about both the end of sprint demo and the retro that I've seen. And these are product management soft skills that you're probably not going to get in a whole lot of other training. But this is a key part of the job. Okay, when I start doing end of sprint demos, almost every time, no one's making any comments except myself or maybe some other senior leaders. And why is that? Again, they don't want to offend anyone. They don't want to feel like they're making them look bad in front of the management. So everyone just tends to keep quiet, or maybe they just don't have any confidence in their comments. And this is just human nature. The same thing in the retro. When I've looked at retro comments, for the first 2-3 sprints, it's all good. Jane did a great job. Harry was awesome. Pradeep was really great. And that's typically what the retro comments look like. And the problem with both of those is it doesn't lead to any improvement. The team's not going to get better when I see that. And I really have to ask some hard questions as a manager, like, really, everything was perfect. There was nothing that could have gone better. And it takes, again, some little courage from some team members to stand up and say, well, actually, I thought that this user story wasn't clear, or we should have split this story, or we didn't have a good handoff with QA, whatever it may be. You have to have the courage to make those comments and make them in a non-personal way that you're not attacking anyone, because again, you have the mentality of you want the team to improve. And the same thing comes from the retro, right? If something didn't go right, you have to make that comment and say, we could have done this better, and do it in a professional manner that someone feels like they're not being attacked, and offer to help them to make it better. This is a key ingredient of Agile methodology, because if you don't do this, there's really no hope for the team to continuously improve. And so it takes this mentality, again, of feedback as a gift, right? And that all is well kind of syndrome is not acceptable. So let's talk about Agile execution best practices. Again, creating a team working agreement will save you so much time and misunderstanding. You got to do it. You got to have end of sprint demos, invite the broad audience, record it, and allay the fear, right? Allay the fear that people are comfortable making comments and criticisms. And why are they doing it? Because they want a better product for the user. Can't emphasize this enough. Retrospectives, use metrics. We're going to talk about metrics in the next module. Estimate, the feedback, and don't have management attend the retro at all. Anti-patterns are just people going 100 miles an hour with no clear agreements, and there's a lot of churn, and that end of sprint demos and retrospectives, people just have a culture of fear and don't like these events because they're afraid they're going to get criticized. And that is not the right mentality. They should like to attend these events because they want feedback, because they know all feedback is a gift and it's going to make a better product. Okay, so in this module, we covered sprint planning, moving that product backlog to the sprint. We talked about estimation, and then we also talked about doing some agile ceremonies, and we talked a lot about soft skills and leadership that you have to provide as that product owner and that product manager. So in the next module, we're going to go a little bit deeper and really focus on the retrospective and the agile metrics. And what metrics should you use? How should you look at them? And how does that help you drive the continuous improvement of your team? As always, thanks again for watching this course. All feedback is a gift. Feel free to contact me anytime via email, make comments below. I did this because I really think it's important that product managers have an opportunity to really enhance their skills and advance their careers. So look forward to seeing you in the next module. Take care.